The invitation came on an unusually crisp September morning, carried by the kind of breezy nonchalance that seemed characteristic of Owen's neighbor, Callum. I had been staying with Owen for a week, escaping the frantic pace of city life to recharge at his lakeside cottage. Callum lived just a few steps away, in a smaller but no less charming house that overlooked the dense forest lining the lake. We'd exchanged pleasantries a few times during my stay, enough for me to gather that he was mid-30s, quietly confident, and perhaps a little too perceptive for comfort. "You should stay a little longer," Callum had said casually over a shared campfire the night before. The flames painted his sharp features in flickering gold and shadow, his hazel eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that felt uncomfortably intimate. "Owen's heading back tomorrow, but the cottage is hardly going anywhere. Why not give yourself a few more days to relax?" I'd been tempted, though propriety had made me hesitate. It wasn't my place to impose, but Owen, sprawled in his camp chair and nursing the last of his beer, had waved the concern away. "Stay. It's not like the cottage has a queue of guests waiting." It was settled without much effort. The next morning, Owen packed his trunk with the efficiency of someone who'd made the trip dozens of times before. Callum leaned against the porch railing, sipping from his ceramic mug as he watched Owen pull away, his expression unreadable. Once we were alone, the air seemed to shift. Callum's casual demeanor didn't falter, but the space between us felt charged, as though a line had been drawn, and I'd unknowingly stepped closer to it. He tilted his head toward the path leading to his house. "Come by later. I've got something you might like." "What kind of something?" His lips quirked in a faint smile. "You'll see." The afternoon unraveled slowly, the hours stretching under a canopy of golden leaves and scattered sunlight. I spent most of it lounging by the water, a book open in my lap, though I hadn't read more than a page or two. My mind kept wandering to Callum's cryptic invitation, the easy way he carried himself, the way his voice dipped slightly when he said, "You'll see." There was no denying that I was curious. As twilight began to settle over the lake, I made my way up the path to his house. It was smaller than Owen's, but meticulously kept, with a wide porch adorned with potted plants and a wind chime that tinkled softly in the breeze. Callum answered the door almost as soon as I knocked, as though he'd been expecting me. "Right on time," he said, his smile widening just enough to reach his eyes. He stepped aside to let me in, and I was immediately enveloped by the scent of cedar and something faintly spicy, like cinnamon, but more subtle. The interior was warm and inviting, lit by the soft glow of several lamps and a crackling fireplace. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the deep leather armchair near the fire. "Can I get you something to drink? Tea, wine, whiskey?" "Wine's good," I replied, sinking into the chair. It was as comfortable as it looked, the leather soft and cool against my skin. He returned moments later with 2 glasses of red wine, handing one to me before settling into the chair opposite mine. The firelight danced across his face, accentuating the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint curve of a smile that seemed permanently etched into his features. He returned moments later with 2 glasses of red wine, handing one to me before settling into his features. "You've been enjoying your time here?" he asked, his tone casual, though his gaze lingered on me a fraction too long. "It's been nice, peaceful." "Peaceful is good," he said, taking a sip of his wine. "But sometimes it's nice to disrupt the peace a little. Keeps things interesting." I raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. He didn't elaborate, instead setting his glass down and leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "you might like a bit of a challenge while you're here." "A challenge?" He nodded. Something different. Something memorable. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't have said why. There was nothing overtly suggestive about his words, yet the way he said them, deliberately, carefully, with an edge of something unspoken, made my skin prickle with anticipation. "Oh, what do you have in mind?" Callum's smile deepened, and for a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet and extended a hand toward me. "Come with me." I hesitated, but only for a moment. The glass of wine was left forgotten on the side table as I placed my hand in his, the warmth of his skin sending a shiver up my arm. He led me through the house to a set of double doors that opened onto the back porch. Beyond it, the forest loomed, dark and inviting. "You trust me?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question I could answer honestly. Not yet. But in that moment, with the firelight casting his silhouette in gold and shadow, I nodded. Callum's hand remained steady as he guided me down the steps of his porch and onto a narrow, winding trail that cut through the trees. The forest seemed to come alive as we moved deeper into its embrace, the air heavy with the mingling scents of damp earth and pine. Every step seemed to amplify the growing tension between us, the silence stretching like a taut string. I couldn't help but steal glances at him as we walked. The sharp line of his jaw was illuminated intermittently by the moonlight filtering through the canopy, his eyes focused on the path ahead. There was an ease to his movements, a confidence that suggested he knew this forest like the back of his hand. It made me feel both comforted and unsettled, as though I were willingly stepping into something unknown, with no clear sense of where it might lead. After what felt like an eternity, the trail opened into a clearing. A small cabin sat in the center, its structure almost swallowed by the surrounding trees. A single lantern glowed in the window, casting a soft, golden light that spilled onto the ground. Callum paused at the edge of the clearing, turning to face me. "This is where it gets interesting," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "What's in there?" His lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Something worth remembering." Before I could ask what he meant, he reached out and gently took my hand, leading me across the clearing. His grip was firm, but not unkind, his fingers warm against my skin. When we reached the cabin, he let go, stepping ahead to open the door. The hinges groaned softly, and he gestured for me to enter first. Inside, the air was warm and faintly perfumed, the scent unfamiliar but intoxicating. The room was small but meticulously arranged, with a single table and 2 chairs occupying the center. A bottle of wine sat on the table alongside a pair of glasses and a platter of fruit and cheese. The lantern from the window burned brighter here, casting long shadows that flickered with the movement of its flame. "Have a seat," Callum said, his voice low and smooth. I hesitated, unsure of what to make of this unexpected intimacy, but something about the way he watched me, steady, unflinching, left little room for refusal. I slid into one of the chairs, the wood cool and sturdy beneath me. Callum moved with deliberate ease, pouring the wine and setting a glass before me. It was the second cup of cold brew Callum had prepared, and I was suddenly thankful he had stayed with us. Specifically, sitting next to "You seem nervous," he said, leaning back in his chair. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt as though he could see right through me, peeling back the layers I'd so carefully constructed. "I didn't know what to expect," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "And now?" I took a sip of the wine, the rich flavor blooming on my tongue. It steadied me, just enough to meet his gaze without faltering. "I'm still not sure." Callum chuckled softly, the sound low and almost musical. Good. It's better that way. He reached for the platter, selecting a piece of fruit and holding it out to me. There was something oddly intimate about the gesture, the way his fingers lingered just long enough for mine to brush against them as I took it. My breath hitched, but I masked it quickly, focusing instead on the burst of sweetness as I bit into the fruit. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd had before. Callum spoke with a kind of raw honesty that was both disarming and magnetic. He told me about his years spent traveling before he'd settled here, about the people he'd met and the lessons he'd learned. His voice was rich and textured, every word carefully chosen, every pause intentional. It was impossible not to be drawn in, but it wasn't just his words that captivated me. It was the way he watched me as he spoke, his gaze unwavering, as though he were cataloging every subtle shift in my expression. There was a weight to it, an intensity that made the air feel heavier with each passing moment. As the night deepened, so did the tension between us. The pauses in our conversation grew longer, the silence charged with an unspoken electricity. I became acutely aware of every movement, every breath, every accidental brush of his hand against mine. It was as though the room itself were conspiring to pull us closer, to dissolve the distance that had once seemed so significant. And then, without warning, Callum leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the lantern's flame. "Since the moment you arrived." My pulse quickened, a sudden rush of adrenaline coursing through me. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "I didn't plan for this," he continued, his tone measured, but edged with something raw. "But there's something about you, something I can't ignore." The room seemed to shrink around us, the space between our chairs feeling insurmountably small and impossibly vast all at once. Callum reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "I don't know what it is," he said, his gaze locked onto mine. "But I need to know if you feel it too." Time stood still as his words hung in the air, heavy with implication. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I felt a warmth creeping up my neck, spreading across my skin. There was no denying the pull I felt toward him, the magnetic force that seemed to draw me closer, despite every rational thought screaming for me to stop. My voice cracked, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "I don't know what this is, but I feel it." The admission hung between us like a fragile thread waiting to be pulled. Callum's expression softened, a flicker of something tender crossing his face. Slowly, deliberately, he stood and circled the table, stopping just inches from where I sat. He extended a hand, his palm open and inviting. "Come with me." For a moment, I hesitated, my mind racing with questions and doubts. But the way he looked at me, steady, unflinching, left no room for refusal. I placed my hand in his, and he guided me to my feet, pulling me close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. "You're sure?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down my spine. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the storm of emotions swirling within me. Whatever this was, wherever it was leading, I knew there was no turning back. Callum's hand tightened slightly around mine, not forceful, but grounding, as though he sensed the maelstrom inside me. He led me toward a door at the far end of the cabin. My heart pounded louder with every step, the sound filling my ears as anticipation curled tightly in my chest. The room beyond was dimly lit, a small lamp on a low table casting a warm amber glow that softened the shadows. The air felt heavier here, as though it carried the weight of unspoken things. Callum stopped just inside the doorway, turning to face me. His hazel eyes seemed darker in the low light, their intensity holding me in place. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, the gesture achingly tender. I barely noticed the door closing behind us until the click of the latch broke the silence. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low but steady. End quote. The question caught me off guard, though I realized almost instantly that it was more than fair. I hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't betray the chaos inside me. "No," I said finally, though my voice wavered. "Not afraid, just unsure." His lips quirked into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Uncertainty is where the best things begin." The heat in my cheeks deepened, and I dropped my gaze, but Callum's fingers caught my chin, tilting my face back up to meet his. "Don't look away," he said softly. "Not now." There was no trace of hesitation in his movements as he closed the distance between us. His hand lingered at my jaw, his thumb tracing a feather-light path along my cheekbone. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, caught in the pull of his gaze. When his lips met mine, it was soft, tentative, a question rather than an answer. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the kiss deepened, his hands sliding to the back of my neck, anchoring me in place. My hands found his chest, the fabric of his shirt, rough under my fingertips. As I steadied myself against him, the sensation of his warmth through the fabric, the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath my palms, made it impossible to ignore the shift that had occurred. This wasn't just curiosity or intrigue. It was something raw, something unspoken that defied easy explanation. Callum pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine as we both caught our breath. His hands remained steady on me, one cradling my neck, the other finding its place at my waist. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, though his voice lacked the resolve to follow through on such a request. I shook my head, the motion slight but certain. "Don't stop." The words seemed to ignite something in him. His grip tightened just enough to draw me closer, and the next kiss was anything but tentative. It was insistent, searching, filled with a hunger that mirrored my own. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the strength in the way he held me, as though afraid I might slip away. The rest of the world ceased to exist. Time itself seemed to slow. Each moment stretched into infinity as Callum's hands explored the contours of my body with a reverence that sent shivers racing across my skin. His lips left a trail of heat along my jaw, my neck, until every nerve ending felt alive, electrified. I found myself backing into the edge of the low table, the hard surface grounding me just enough to catch my breath. Callum pulled back slightly, his hands braced on either side of me as his eyes searched mine. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The vulnerability in his words struck something deep within me. "I think I do," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He smiled then, a fleeting curve of his lips that melted into something more serious, more intent. He reached for my hand, guiding it to his chest, where his heartbeat thundered beneath my palm. "Do you feel that?" he asked. "That's you." The weight of his confession hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I didn't have the words to respond, so I let my actions speak instead. My fingers curled against the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer as I kissed him. With everything I didn't know how to say, Callum responded in kind, his hands finding their way to my hips, lifting me onto the table as though I weighed nothing. The shift in perspective made my breath catch, my legs instinctively wrapping around him to keep from losing my balance, but he wasn't going to let me fall. Not tonight. Not ever. The kiss deepened, each movement more deliberate, more consuming. His hands slid beneath the hem of my shirt, his fingers skimming over bare skin and leaving a trail of fire in their wake. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer until there was no space left between us. It wasn't long before the table's edge became too restrictive, its hard surface a reminder of the limits we were rapidly outgrowing. Callum lifted me effortlessly, his strength an unspoken promise as he carried me to the bed. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the lamp, its light casting long shadows that danced across the walls, mirroring the storm of emotions within me. He laid me down gently, his movements careful, almost reverent. For a moment, he simply looked at me, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just desire. It was deeper, more complicated, laced with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "This feels," I began, my voice trailing off as I searched for the right word. "Right." Callum finished for me, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, the simplicity of his answer settling over me like a balm. And then there were no more words, only the language of touch, of whispered breaths and tangled limbs, of a connection that felt as though it had been waiting for this moment to come alive. The hours blurred into a tapestry of sensations, the warmth of Callum's skin against mine, the way his hands seemed to know exactly where to linger, the quiet urgency in his every movement. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, raw, unfiltered, and achingly real. By the time we lay tangled in the sheets, the room bathed in the pale light of a rising moon, I felt as though I'd been unmade and remade all at once. Callum's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my shoulder as silence settled between us. "I didn't expect this," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "Neither did I admitted, my words carrying the weight of everything I couldn't yet articulate. He pressed a kiss to my temple, his lips lingering there for a moment. "But you're not regretting it." I turned to face him, my fingers brushing against the stubble on his jaw. "No," I said firmly. "Not for a second." And as we lay there, the forest humming softly outside the window, I realized that, whatever line we had crossed, it was one I had no desire to retreat from. The forest remained eerily quiet in the hours that followed, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Moonlight spilled across the room in soft beams, casting Callum's features in sharp relief. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, but I could feel the tension still humming beneath his skin, mirrored in my own restlessness. Sleep felt impossible. Every inch of my body was acutely aware of his nearness, the heat radiating from him as his arm remained possessively draped over me. I shifted slightly, and Callum's eyes flickered open almost instantly, alert despite the late hour. He studied me for a long moment, the shadows of sleep still clouding his gaze, but quickly replaced by a quiet intensity. "Can't sleep?" he murmured, his voice rough, the sound vibrating against my ear where he leaned closer. I shook my head, a small smile playing at my lips. "I think you ruined me for a rest tonight." A low chuckle escaped him, and his hand found mine beneath the covers, threading our fingers together. The simplicity of the gesture, the warmth of his palm against mine, made my chest ache with something I didn't dare name. Callum shifted onto his side, propping his head on one hand as he gazed down at me, his expression softer now, tinged with curiosity. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, the weight of his question catching me off guard. What was I thinking? That I didn't want this moment to end? That he'd unraveled something in me I wasn't sure I could ever put back together? That I felt more alive in these stolen hours than I had in years? I'm thinking about how none of this feels real, I admitted finally, my voice quiet but steady. Like it's happening to someone else. Callum's brow furrowed slightly, his thumb brushing a lazy pattern across the back of my hand. It's real, he said, the certainty in his tone anchoring me, every second of it. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding, until I found myself nodding, the truth of them sinking into my skin. Callum leaned forward then, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was far gentler than the ones we'd shared earlier. It was slow, deliberate, a quiet affirmation of everything that had passed between us and everything that still lingered unspoken. As the night deepened, the intensity between us began to shift, softening into something more intimate, more reflective. Callum's hands moved with the same confidence, the same intent, but there was a new tenderness in his touch, as though he were memorizing the feel of me beneath his fingers. My body responded instinctively, arching toward him, and we found ourselves lost in each other again, the hours melting into a haze of sensation. It was nearly dawn when we finally fell into a restless sleep, the first light of morning creeping through the window and painting the room in muted hues. Callum's arm remained securely around me, his breathing steady and even, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. For the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though the world beyond this small cabin had ceased to matter. When I woke, the sun was high, its rays spilling golden light across the room. Callum was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with his back to me. His hair was tousled, his shoulders bare, the faint scars that marked his skin catching the sunlight in a way that made them seem almost deliberate, like brushstrokes on a canvas. He turned when he felt me stir, his expression unreadable for a moment, before softening into a small smile. "Good morning." "Morning," I murmured, my voice still thick with sleep. I propped myself up on one elbow, watching him as he reached for his shirt, the movement unhurried. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. A little," he replied, glancing over his shoulder at me. "Not much." I frowned, sitting up fully now, the sheets pooling around my waist. "Something on your mind?" Callum hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the window before returning to me. "Just thinking about what happens next." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. He wasn't wrong to wonder. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, stepped into a territory that was as exhilarating as it was uncertain. The clarity of morning brought with it the inevitability of consequences, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret any of it. "I don't know," I said honestly, the words thick in my throat, "but I don't want this to end." The admission seemed to catch him off guard. Callum turned fully to face me, his eyes searching mine, as though trying to discern the truth of my words. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Neither do I." We spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, the unspoken tension from earlier giving way to something calmer, more assured. Callum made coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin as we lingered over small talk and stolen glances. It felt almost domestic, the kind of ordinary intimacy that comes with time and familiarity, and yet it was anything but ordinary to me. By midday, the warmth of the sun had coaxed us outside, where we found ourselves back on the narrow trail that had led us to the cabin the night before. The forest was alive with the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves, the air fragrant with the scent of wild flowers and pine. Callum walked a step ahead, his hand brushing against mine occasionally. As the path narrowed, "You'll have to come back," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his tone. "Come back?" "To the cottage," he clarified. "To this." The simplicity of his statement, the way he said it, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, sent a warm rush through me. I nodded, unable to keep the smile from my face. "I'd like that." Callum stopped then, turning to face me fully. The sunlight filtering through the trees caught the flecks of gold in his eyes, making them seem almost otherworldly. He reached out, his hands finding mine with the same ease that had characterized every one of his movements since the moment we'd met. "Whatever this is," he said, his voice low but steady, "it's not something I want to let go of." The honesty in his words, the rawness of his expression, left me breathless. I squeezed his hands, the gesture small but significant. "Neither do I." And as we stood there in the heart of the forest, the sunlight dappling our skin and the world fading away around us, I realized that whatever came next, it wouldn't matter. This moment, this connection, was real. It was ours. The rest of the day passed in a haze of stolen glances and quiet touches, the unspoken understanding between us growing stronger with each moment. By the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, we found ourselves back at Callum's cabin, the familiar warmth of the space wrapped around us as we stepped inside, the door clicking softly shut behind us. Callum lingered for a moment, his back against the door as he watched me cross the room. The weight of his gaze sent a shiver up my spine. But it wasn't unsettling. It was grounding, anchoring me to the reality of the moment. I turned to face him, my heart racing as he pushed off the door and closed the distance between us in a few long strides. "You feel it too," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, though it carried the weight of a confession. "I do," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. His hand reached for mine, his fingers lacing through mine with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "Then let's stop pretending this is something we can walk away from." There was no hesitation as he drew me closer, his other hand finding the small of my back as he pulled me against him. The kiss that followed was different from the ones we'd shared before, less restrained, more urgent. It was a collision of everything we'd been holding back, every unspoken word and suppressed desire spilling over in a single moment. My hands found their way to his shoulders, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as though afraid he might disappear if I let go. His lips moved against mine with a fervor that left me breathless, his hands roaming over my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The world outside the cabin faded into irrelevance, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the soft crackle of the fireplace. We stumbled toward the bed, the journey a blur of tangled limbs and whispered affirmations. Callum's touch was both confident and tender, his hands guiding me with a reverence that made my chest ache. When he laid me down, his gaze met mine, and the intensity in his eyes stole the air from my lungs. "You sure?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension in his jaw. "Yes," I replied, the word escaping in a rush of breath. "I've never been more sure." That was all he needed. His lips found mine again, the kiss deepening as his hands explored every inch of me. The boundaries we'd clung to so desperately were gone now, replaced by an unspoken understanding that this moment was inevitable. Every touch, every movement felt deliberate, as though we were mapping uncharted territory with the care of explorers who knew they might never return. The hours that followed were a symphony of sensations: skin against skin, the warmth of his breath on my neck, the soft murmur of my name on his lips. It was a slow unraveling, each layer peeled back with the kind of deliberate patience that made every touch feel like a revelation. Callum moved with a confidence that belied the vulnerability in his eyes, his every action a silent promise that he would never let me fall. When it was over, we lay tangled in the sheets, the soft glow of the fire casting long shadows across the room. Callum's arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my shoulder as we lay in comfortable silence. My head rested against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a soothing counterpoint to the whirlwind of emotions still swirling inside me. I never thought I'd feel this way again, I admitted, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Callum pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his lips lingering there for a moment before he spoke. Neither did I, but I'm glad I took the chance. The words settled over me like a balm, their simplicity masking the depth of what they carried. I tilted my head to meet his gaze, my fingers brushing lightly against his jaw. So what happens now? His lips quirked into a small, thoughtful smile. We figure it out. Together. The certainty in his voice made my chest tighten, and I couldn't help but smile in return. For the first time, in what felt like forever, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like an open road, full of possibility. The next morning came quietly, the soft light of dawn spilling through the window and waking me from a dreamless sleep. Callum was already awake, propped up on one elbow as he watched me with a soft smile. There was no urgency in his gaze, only a quiet contentment that mirrored my own. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my lips curving into a smile as I reached up to brush a strand of hair from his face. We spent the day, much like the one before, wrapped in the kind of easy companionship that felt as though it had been years in the making rather than days. The forest seemed brighter, the air crisper, every detail of the world around us sharper and more vivid. It was as though stepping over that invisible line had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. When it was time for me to leave, Callum walked me back to Owen's cottage, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back as we made our way along the familiar trail. The goodbye that followed was quieter than I'd expected, marked by a return visit. My heart mothered, my entire being sink. My heart started to pound, and the promise of a return visit. As I drove away, the cabin disappearing in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and hope. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Whatever it might bring, Callum had been right. Uncertainty was where the best things began.